Hi, everyone, and welcome to day 3 of International Careers Week. We're really excited to have Major Cory with us today. Major Cory is the State Partnership Program Director for the Montana National Guard. Major Cory graduated cum laude from the United States Naval Academy, and he was commissioned into the United States Marine Corps. He has served 10 years active before returning home to Montana. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Great. Why don't we just jump in? What inspired you to join the U.S. Marine Corps, and can you share a bit about your personal journey into that career?
Yeah, absolutely. First, again, a big thanks to the World Affairs Council. I've worked with you guys actually over the past couple of years over at the university, and so it's always great to be back. But and that's actually a hard question because when you're young, you don't really know what kind of pulls at your heartstrings, right? Until you can kind of have some time to reflect back on it. But I would say, we live in a society today where we're very hyper individualistic, which is a good thing. But I think individually, we all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. And that was really the big thing that drew me to the military, because right away you can have an impact and get into a whole world of affairs kind of at the forefront of a lot of what's going on politically and internationally. And so that's really what drew me in to service. And I was also in the post 9/11 era, pretty close to it. So there was certainly a lot of emotion still running high from that event. So the combination of all those things really, made me drift towards military service. But I didn't really have family members who served or anything like that, and so really those intangible things really is what drew me to service.
Can you tell us what is the Montana National Guard?
Sure. Yeah. So the Montana National Guard, we're what we call a joint force. So we have both Army and Air Force. And we are your traditional guardsmen in the sense that we drill 2 days a month, and then 1 week or 2 weeks a year. And we have a whole litany of military specialties that you can join, ranging from law to infantry to logistics. And then we train for both stateside mission sets. So those are your traditional responding to state natural disasters and what have you. But then we also prepare for a federal mission, which are wartime contingencies or disaster contingencies abroad. So if an earthquake hits in in South Asia, like it did in 2014, National Guard members can deploy to respond to that disaster. Likewise, if there's a major contingency operation going on, the president can activate the National Guard to go deploy in support of that.
For students that are considering a career in the Marines or the military, what steps can they take to prepare themselves physically and mentally for the challenges of military service?
It's a good question. And what I always tell students or anybody who's thinking about joining the military is, one, first and foremost, make sure you're doing it for the right reason. You might sit down with a recruiter and they talk to you about all the benefits that you can reap from military service, which is certainly true. But I would always tell a student, hey, make sure you're joining for the right reason, and that's to serve something bigger than yourself. To believe in the nation, to believe in service is really important. Because there's going to be times in the military where things that you do are challenging, and you're going to need an intangible benefit of why you join to keep you motivated to doing good work. And so ensure first and foremost that you're joining because you have a part of you wants to join for the right reason. Other than that, I always tell students, make sure you're morally, mentally, and physically fit. So as a young soldier, airman, Marine, sailor, whatever you end up being, if you're enlisted within the first year or two, like you could be what we call a non-commissioned officer, which gives you a lot of authority and autonomy to lead troops. And that's the way Western militaries are designed. Conversely, if you're an officer, day one, you'll be in charge of a lot of people and you'll be in charge of some very complicated mission sets. And so you have to be morally oriented to ensure that you're making decisions in complex environments ethically. physically fit is, it goes without saying, the physical component goes within your, the mental health component, and you need to be both in the military, to be frankly honest. And then the mental component is, if you look at the military broadly, our entry level recruits on the whole are pretty smart people. In fact, there was a meta-analysis done by, I think it was Pew, but research that our military candidates are on average smarter than their peers in the civilian sector, and that includes college entry folks. So I would say right now, like, if you're interested in the military service, just Google military reading lists and start knocking some of those books out, and start honing your mind to think, to be a thinker too, because that's what's required in the American military. Is we want leaders who, on one hand, can be, understand orders and execute those orders, but then think critically as well. And that requires you to be intellectually supple.
With a career in the Marines, where have you traveled for work? What was one of the most memorable trips?
I mean, I've been all over the place. Actually, just 3 or 4 days ago, I just got back from the Kyrgyz Republic in Turkmenistan, where I was there just doing a couple weeks of work out there. But probably over the last year, I've spent 3 or 4 months overseas in Central and South Asia. But I've also been probably to, I don't know, 30 different countries for work purposes. But some of the most memorable moments that I've had, and everybody I talked to in the military has been, working with individuals at their unit level, because there's a whole host of things that go into working at a unit level. And it all comes down to ensuring that everybody is operating and functioning at the highest levels of performance possible. And that requires a whole lot of things. So that requires that you're taking care of people, that you're looking out for them, that you're pushing them, that you're pushing yourself. And that culminated for me in the most memorable moment, frankly, was in Afghanistan. I had a young corporal. His name was Cory Jones. He's now a lawyer out on the East Coast, but he was a squad leader for me, and I was a platoon commander, and we're in a place called Sangin. And the Taliban had flooded a canal which bifurcated our patrol bases. So he was on one side that I couldn't get to, which was quite a ways away outside of what we call indirect support. So, and so this young man was having to figure out things in this counterinsurgency environment of how to be basically a de facto mayor. So when there's a sanitation issue or a tribal strife issue, he was contending with those issues and trying to figure out ways to find solutions for them. And by the way, the caveat is he was also, fighting one of the most violent counterinsurgencies in modern military history. So watching a young Marine do something that, Department of State, USAID people normally do on his own in a dangerous, precarious environment was very memorable and inspirational. And so, I could tell you about some of the fun moments, more, I guess you could say, germane moments to military service, which would be, probably have 250 free fall jumps under my belt. I mean, just the partnerships you make overseas and the events you get to go do with foreign partners. There's too many memorable moments to count to kind of hone down on one, but hopefully that kind of answers the question.
Yes, definitely. I'm curious, you mentioned that the Montana National Guard gets deployed when something occurs. When was the last time Montana National Guard was deployed, and what had happened?
Well, they're deployed all the time. In fact, we have several units overseas right now in Iraq and Kuwait. And we have folks overseas in what we call individual augmentee billets globally. And we're busy, in a lot of ways. What we find out more times than not, that we have more volunteers than we do not volunteers for those mission sets, because it's, exciting to go be on the front edge of, military and foreign policy. And then before that, every year we've had, somebody forward deployed. But in terms of like a, huge units deploying, it's been a long time. But we also have other events going on. So we have bilateral affairs officers, which are overseas right now. So they go live so they work for me, and they go live in the countries that we're partnered with. So I have a bilateral affairs officer in the Kyrgyz Republic, one in Turkmenistan, and one in Sri Lanka that covers down in both Sri Lanka and the Maldives for me. And so that's kind of a litmus test for what the Montana National Guard is doing. Now, we also deploy stateside. So was it 2 years ago during the huge fire season, we had hundreds of Montana National Guard members fighting fires, doing logistics for them, doing planning with our civilian counterparts and DES, which is Montana's Department of Emergency Services. And so that's an example of a stateside deployment. We also had, when the major floods hit last year, I believe it was, we had a lot of our aviation units or pilots deployed. I think they conducted 80 heliborne rescues during that time. So so whenever there's a crisis, we respond to it. So you're always involved in things. And that's not to mention COVID support and things like that. So there's a lot that we're doing in terms of staying relevant in the community and for the nation at large.
How did COVID impact the National Guard?
Significantly. And so we executed events and missions ranging from security to testing all the way to our physicians supporting local hospitals and things like that. So it was a robust response from that basic security level all the way up to statewide policy level.
I may mispronounce this, so I apologize in advance, but do you think the conflict with the Houthis will escalate to a point where the US and UK will interfere more?
Oh, with the Houthi rebels in Yemen?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a long history, right? So you could look back to Thomas Jefferson's time in the war with the Barbary pirates. So that's North Africa. And at the time, we sent in the nascent U.S. Navy to basically interdict pirates operating in that region because they were having significant economic impacts on U.S. and global trade at the time. And so what we're seeing now in the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the strait there coming out of on the coast of Yemen, is nothing new. It's just history singing itself to a different tune. And so in my question, I would return the question rhetorically to people to contemplate, what would you do if the U.S. stock market tanked 20% as a result of the Bab el-Mandeb being shut down, where the majority of oil maritime shipping comes out of? Are you okay with that? You know what I mean? And that's what's at stake here is not some rebel group who are bad people doing things to us, but it's them having an economic effect on a global liberal world order that has brought human existence into an era of unprecedented peace. And so now that's at risk from a lot of different fronts, the Houthi rebels representing one front that's directly threatening economic trade. So that's what's at stake. Will it escalate? I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I think if I were to assign the probability is more high, like it's higher than it is lower for that right now, simply because in this case, all roads lead back to Israel and Gaza and what's going on there. And that factors into the strategic calculus that not just the Houthis, but their overseers, the Iranians are using right now. So that's the big question, I think, right now. I think what's most likely is that, and hopefully more probable, is that you'll see a broader coalition coming out of like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and different places from there, and India, who also have vital interests in the region, to start to interdict some of those rebel and terrorist activities in the Bab el-Mandeb region.
Are young people in today's world joining and being a part of the National Guard or the U.S. military at large as much as they used to be?
No, it's significantly less than it was, years ago. And just generally, I think there was like a malaise and a kind of a discontent in the United States for many reasons. But I always tell people we have to remind ourselves we are living in the most peaceful vibrant times in history. It's probably one of the most interesting times to be alive. And you have artificial intelligence. You have a lot of different geopolitical movements right now. Like, why would you not want to be involved? But in that, and making a difference, even at a very small level, it's the times are electric, so to speak. But unfortunately, young people today are not joining the military. But it's not even just the military; it's organizations in general, like local soccer league. Participation's down. Everything's kind of down. So we're seeing a citizen's responsibility sort of decaying, and that certainly has an effect on military recruitment.
Why did you choose to go the military path?
So, I kind of touched on it earlier. Again, it's hard to, when you're young, to kind of put into words why you join. But again, when I was growing up, that was kind of, everything was very hyper individualized. We're at the very oldest end of the millennial generation, and everything was about, I remember hearing about, hey, make sure when you graduate, like, you should really look about like retirement, and like, so basically preparing me to die well, I guess, like comfortably. Like, I want to live a little bit, and so but I also want to live in a sense, and I want to make sure that what I do and the way I spend my time is value added, and not necessarily completely what's in it for me attitude. And so that was the part of it. And then in my search for what I wanted to do, that was the military naturally fit into kind of my mindset and where I was focused on, because I wanted to get out immediately into an environment where I could cut my teeth, and the goings-ons of the world. And that has led me to where I am now, and to what I consider one of the best jobs in the world. But hopefully that answers your question. It's a good question, but it's a hard one to answer in totality.
What advice would you give to young people who want to pursue a career in the government sector of the Foreign Service?
Yeah, sure. So I actually work a lot with the Foreign Service on a daily basis, actually. So Department of State. Actually, was it just yesterday, I was on with the U.S. ambassador to Kyrgyzstan. I'm going out in a couple of weeks to meet with our partner nations ambassadors. And so my current job has me working a lot in the Foreign Service sector. So, and I get to work with those professionals on a daily basis, which is a real opportunity to work with those people. I would tell people, one, that I'll tell you 3 inspirational things and 3 honest things to prepare your mind for. So as you get there, the inspirational things are: 1, you get to travel the world and hopefully make a difference, in a big way, with our partners across the world. The second inspirational thing is that you open up your life to a whole new experience that you otherwise would not have, whether that be, cultural engagements, all the way down to what you're doing for a specific job. You really open a ton of new opportunities and horizons that you otherwise would not have. And then the third thing is, frankly, it's not traditional, right? And so you're going to be doing something that every year it's going to be different, and you're going to be focused on a trajectory in your life that isn't set out for you step by step. And I think that's really neat. Some of the honest things what I tell people to prepare themselves for is that you're going to be working within a bureaucracy, and anytime you work within a bureaucracy, you're going to have headaches and struggles and things like that. So just be prepared for that, understand it, and embrace it. That can sometimes be soul killing a little bit, but once you can get past that, you'll have 10%, 15% of your time dedicated to like a bureaucracy, and the other time you'll be dedicated to doing really good work. The second thing I would say is take risk. As Americans, we become incredibly risk averse. So take risks in your career, take risks in doing things. Just make sure you're doing them with a good intent, and that you have enough humility to recognize mistakes, and you can correct those mistakes. But take risk. And then the third thing is that it's hard at the end of the day. And when you're young, to be frank, you're just gaining experience and knowledge, and things like that to develop a base of knowledge. So that way, when you're older, whether that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the road, you have a wealth of knowledge to actually make real important policy or geopolitical level decisions. But those first few years, when you're young, you are gaining a lot of experience, and it's just like learning an instrument. It's painful and boring at first, but with increased repetition, you become better and better. I guess that's true for many jobs, but I think it's particularly true when you're in, a foreign service job, because it's very difficult and things change a lot.
What was one of your most unnerving experiences abroad?
I mean, again, like unpredictability is everywhere, and we like to teach people you're safe everywhere, and everybody, which is not true, right? And so, when you first get out into the world, into an uncontrolled environment, anything can happen. More often than not, you're going to find out that people are generally very good, and that's a comforting thing. But the world being what it is, there's times in which you'll be faced with some serious challenges if you get out there into the world and really wrestle with it. And so I have a lot of different places. I mean, when I was a young 22-year-old, I was responsible for 55 people in a very dangerous place in the world, conducting, combat operations. And so that was certainly unnerving. I would say was probably the most unnerving I've been, simply because of the responsibility I held. And, with that responsibility, you're expected to be bold, confident, even though you have no idea what you're doing. And you're making decisions that have serious consequences. And so that in and of itself is probably the most unnerving time. And then you get repetitions at it, you get smarter, you get better, and then you become a mentor. And those times become less and less unnerving as time goes on.
What was your biggest hurdle you had to overcome in life to get to where you are today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's, boy, I would say, so honestly, so getting into certain, like the academy was actually really tough to get into for me, just because of the academic hurdles. But honestly, I would say the biggest hurdle for me was understanding what path to take. Frankly, I'll be honest, I was pretty fortunate in my life to have a good family and whatnot. So a lot of obstacles that might be common to other people in different countries or anywhere else, I didn't have as much. And so my biggest thing was understanding, okay, how do I actually determine what I want to do to go sacrifice and serve something bigger than myself? And then it was convincing people around me that the military was the right decision, which upon retrospect was never would agree, like the absolute right decision. But convincing people who love you to do something that might be perceived as dangerous or even frankly beneath your station, which the military certainly is not. That's a kind of a faux pas we have in this country. But that was hard to convince people of that, and that was an obstacle that had to be overcome.
Earlier, you mentioned the liberal world order. Could you explain that concept more? How big of a role does the US military play into the world economy?
So the global world order in a nutshell, can best be described as post-World War II, a rules-based system designed around a few basic tenets. One is free trade and global trade, right? In the sense that people of any nation are allowed to transit our international waterways freely without the worry of being pestered by any other nation state or individual group to conduct trade freely. And then the other tenet was that is human rights. Obviously coming out of World War II, whether it was the Japanese action in China or the Nazi actions against Jews, and there's a whole other deep history there of other issues. Human rights really took the forefront, which is an evolving thing in human history. We we like to think very shortly about what human rights means, but it wasn't until after World War II that we really understood what those things mean. So it's not that we say, hey, everybody needs to be treated this way immediately. It's this evolving concept of how we as humans treat each other better. But that became forefront of the global liberal world order. And then allowing, states to interact freely in ways that benefited their own interests without infringing on the interests of others to the best degree possible. And within that, there was a peace construct that was developed and ultimately survived through Korea and Vietnam, through kind of the Kissinger times, that has allowed us to live in a relatively prosperous time. Even our poor today live better than our middle class or even wealthy did 200 years ago. So that's kind of what, in a nutshell, the global liberal world order is. And the US economy specifically is the most important piece to ensuring that stability. And what backs that up? Well, it's two things, really: the good faith in US credit, and then two, the US military. The US military, specifically, in my opinion, the Navy is the most important part to that, right? There's a book called the Influence of Sea Power on History, which argues that sea power is critical to ensuring that the global commons, as we call them, or the maritime lines of communication, are open and free. As we know today, that is under stress more than it's been since the end of World War II.
You mentioned peace just a minute ago. Do you participate in any peace building activities?
Yeah, so under the United Nations, there's a whole litany of peacekeeping operation lines of effort. So I'm focused right now on building, for example, the Kyrgyz Level 2 Field Hospital. A Level 2 Field Hospital, they're able to deploy under UN missions, mostly to Africa, but globally. And so our job in the Montana National Guard, and we're partnered with active duty components, is to build partner capacity so that way they can go do those things. The other line of effort that we're focused on is humanitarian demining. So we've been in Sri Lanka. Our EOD technicians have been all over Eastern Europe and other places doing demining activities. Those are our explosive ordnance disposal folks. And we send them on, my program sends them on exchanges and missions every year, probably 3 or 4 times a year. So,
what skills are most helpful for pursuing a career in service?
I'd say two. If I had to bring it down to 3 things I mentioned earlier, one is let's call it your mental fitness. So just being curious, being eager to learn, and being a self-learner. That will help you be a critical thinker, and that will help you learn, because the one thing you'll learn in the military is that every day you have to come ready to work and ready to learn, because we are at the forefront of a lot of changing things in the world, and you have to be, I hate to use the word well-educated because that means a certain thing, but you have to be a self-learner. The second thing I would say is you don't have to be some sort of crazy physical shit, but you have to be physically fit enough for military service, and physical fitness can be a real joy in life, and so I'd say develop that. And then the last thing is, again, that moral fitness. We live in a very complicated world. We like, if you read the news on any source that you're in, we like to distill things down into very simple comments. Most of these folks aren't in the fight, so to speak, and they don't. And what the true nature of the world is that it is very complicated. It is very complex, and there's things that are at work that are very difficult, and it requires somebody who is not just smart, but morally competent too, to make decisions at the very smallest tactical level, all the way up to the geostrategic level. And if all of those levels aren't, you don't have more people trying to make the right moral decision in very difficult situations, then that's challenging. And so you need to ensure that you have a good, solid moral foundation if you want to come in. But those are the 3 things I'd say broadly to focus on and be knowledgeable about.
How can someone get into humanitarian work in the military?
Well, I'd say before I get into the military, I'd say if you're really just focused on humanitarian efforts, I would strongly recommend looking at other programs too to broaden your options. So there's you know, the Peace Corps, there's Teach for America, there's a few other organizations. Those are the two I work with mostly. I'd recommend. They're great organizations that get you out there focused on humanitarian work at a very kind of, let's call that tactical or skills-based level, right? And those are good options to look at if you're looking for just strictly the kind of a humanitarian effort. From the military perspective, honestly, if you want to do humanitarian missions more often, the National Guard is where it's at. The National Guard maintains its primary purpose is, well, one of its primary purposes is what we call DISCA, which is Defense Support to Civil Authority. So that's our soldiers and airmen going out fighting fires, saving people from floods, doing community resiliency projects, mostly from an engineering perspective, and things like that. So that's really, if you're looking to do humanitarian type work, the National Guard is where you should look to do that. Yeah.
How does the Montana National Guard engage with local communities right here in Montana and respond to emergencies or natural disasters?
Yeah, I could talk all day about that. I'll talk kind of from a policy perspective first. So the governor of Montana or any state will request an activation, and then we'll go on what's called state active duty orders. And then across our entire force, we can respond to any disaster that the governor directs us to. More often than not, that's fires, floods, natural disasters, things like that. But we also respond to cyber threats. We have a cyber team. In fact, I remember when Great Falls Public Schools was hacked a couple of years ago, and I was there. Our cyber team went out to help do just some basic cyber forensics. And so the way in which we respond is depending upon our capabilities, which are vast, and then how the state requires us through official and formal functions to request us to do that, is how that works. But we could talk all day about vignettes on how we respond to a range of disasters.
Could you explain some of your experience with intelligence, counterintelligence? What do roles for civilians look like in this field?
Yeah, it's a broad field. And so, when you talk about civilians, you're talking about like interagency work, like defense intelligence activity, and, all the way up to the CIA. But from like a military perspective, it, gets, when you say I'm a human intelligence, right, it's like, sounds really cool. Just like anything in life, a lot of things that sound really cool generally are not, dump a grain of salt on it. But what that is it's basically, for lack of a better phrase, and more times than not, talking to people in a normal way to get good information on the ground level about what's going on. More often than not, this is involved around what we call civil infrastructure. So when we go into a place, we want to know where, for example, mosques are or churches. We want to know what the sanitation infrastructure is. We want to know these things so that way we can attempt to align resources to do the right thing and find and do needs-based assessments. And then you can get all the way to the other spectrum on offensive human intelligence missions, which is a whole different genre of a very, 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 very small select group of people who go do kind of more of the missions that you might see. The movies don't accurately depict it, but that would do things that are more revolving around what we call national intelligence priorities. So like no fail mission type things. So yeah, that's kind of the best way to describe human intelligence. But again, more often than not, it sounds terrible. It's generally not, and it's generally a lot more blasé than you would otherwise think it is.
If I joined the Montana National Guard and moved to another state, would I be insured a job in that state's National Guard?
Yes, you would. It's called an interstate transfer. They happen all the time. And before you make that move, obviously you just want to communicate that to your leadership so that way they can start making sure you're matched with an appropriate job when you get to that state before you get there. But it happens all the time.
Is there anything you wish civilians would understand more about the military?
It's the last 20 years, the military has really developed and grown quite a bit. The military has found itself at the forefront of, frankly, things it shouldn't be, like, foreign development and things like that. And so understand, like, what is the purpose of a military first and foremost? the purpose of a military is to fight and win our nation's battles, period, the end, right? But we end up doing a lot more than that, simply because, frankly, we're in the environment. We're the people who are out there making the difference. You know, when I was in Afghanistan, I was the one building wells and things like that. That's a USA job, but they weren't doing that. Maybe because it's too precarious, something like that. And so understanding what is the, like, when you know, I always tell people, when I'm spending taxpayers' dollars, I want to go down on the street and look at a teacher who's making $40,000 a year and say, I spent your tax money on doing this activity, and here's how it benefits you, because this is what your military is supposed to do. And so what I tell people is understand what is the military supposed to do. We're supposed to, you know, fight and win our nation's battles. But, and actually, I should caveat that with saying our first job is to do security cooperation activities globally to prevent that, first and foremost, right? But that's what we do. The second thing I would say is, you know, it's with how busy the world is now, is understand why is it important to have a, you know, not global presence, but why is it important to be knowledgeable about what is going on in the world right now? Because of the way the world is, whether you agree with it or not, we are interconnected in ways that we have never been before. And so if the Bab el-Mandeb or the Straits of Malacca gets shut down because an anti-ship cruise missile is now stationed there, that's going to affect our ability to live our lives in a fundamental way. You know, and so understanding the strategic choke points of the world, the geopolitics of things going on, is really, really important right now, more so than ever, to be educated about those things. So that's one thing I would say is I wish people would understand a little bit more on is those nuances. And it's hard to identify that and learn that, but I would say make that effort to, you know, don't just read the newspapers about it. Maybe that's a good starting point to keep active or up to date on like really current trends, but go to your library and pick up a book, ask your librarian, like, hey, what do you recommend on, you know, reading about the Barbary pirates and then how that relates to the Houthi rebels right now, you know, and how does, you know, US military power and economic power, like, why are those things important in the South China Sea right now? You know, and things like that. I think that's where, you know, where we're lacking. We kind of like to go into our social media feeds and our Netflix and forget about the world a little bit, but understanding what's going on in the world, I think right now is more important than ever, and being humble enough to talk about it, and understanding that none of us know everything, and what is true today might be false tomorrow, is important. Having a background on why that's changed is important.
How does the chain of command structure in the military interact with international agencies?
Well, the first thing I'd say about the chain of command in the military is that it's, you know, it's stressed. It's very important, but in the United States military and Western militaries in general, we have what's called mission command, where we enable and empower our youngest, most junior people to make big decisions. And that's I can't underscore that enough. And so when we go forward, or we're here in the United States working in an interagency environment, we, you know, our hierarchy generally is not synonymous or compatible with interagency. And so a corporal or a sergeant, you know, might be the better fit to work within the structure of an interagency, you know, scenario than a colonel or something else. And so what we try to do is take that mission command, right, that decentralized command model, find the right person to plug in and play to be a liaison with whatever interagency organization we're working with to accomplish whatever goal we're setting out to achieve. I'd also say is that the best thing that we do is finding the right person to work in the interagency world, because it requires somebody who's patient, who's calm, tactful, and things like that. Now, there are joint interagency cells that do what we call, like, you know, synergize or coordinate efforts amongst an interagency world. But again, everything, you know, you have to understand where we're at and where we've come from. 20 years ago, interagency cooperation is very different than it is now. You know, interagency cooperation is the flavor of the month, so to speak, right now. And so people are very much willing to work across DoD, Department of State, USAID, NGOs, etc., because of how decentralized and chaotic the world's become as a result of 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. So it's become a lot easier to do interagency, but what it comes down to is personal relationships at the end of the day. We work in a people, in the military especially, but our interagency world, it's a people business first. Hierarchies kind of come second when you're working in that interagency world. And it's complicated, to say the least. You're kind of herding cats, as we say, to accomplish things. And everybody understands that, but that's just the nature of it. But I'd rather have that than a stovepiped, centralized government that tells us everything to do. Because then then the experts in the room don't really get to flourish. So good question, hard to answer. Hopefully I touched on some of the main topics for you.
How frequently are the UN's SDGs referred to in your line of work?
UN SDGs, are you talking about the their Security Cooperation Division? That's an acronym I'm frankly unfamiliar with, but if somebody could illuminate that.
Ali, you would know the answer to this. What is SDGs? Sustainable Development Goals.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yep, of course.
Like,
so actually,
I just not off the top of my head.
Well, it's like, in the military, if you say one acronym, it can mean 10 different things sometimes. So no, thank you for that. So that's an interesting question. So, the UN is really like a policy level, kind of thing. And I tend to take signals from that and then attempt to find tractionable ground level events that we can do to support some of those policy level things emanating from that. So what's really unique and cool about my program is that we do whole of government. And so I'm working with Director Dorrington from DEQ. Let me take him for example. So we are actually working with the Turkmen government. Turkmenistan is a global methane super emitter. They're a super emitter mostly because of legacy Soviet LNG infrastructure. And we actually conducted our first video teleconference between Montana DEQ, Bridger Photonics, which is a methane identification company, BioSqueeze, and Well Done, to see about, hey, is there a pathway forward where we can use Montana know-how and technology to address global methane emissions in a major way? We don't know where it's going, but it's certainly a possibility. And so that's one initiative that we're doing. And as we know from the current COP meeting in Dubai that just happened, it was hard to come to a conclusion on CO2 emissions, which is understandable, but methane became kind of the major topic. And Turkmenistan's in my portfolio, and so we have a wonderful DEQ director right now, who is able to bring together a lot of resources and know-how to address a global issue, right? And we're doing that across, political spectrums, belief systems, and things like that, which is really cool to see, coming to fruition. So that's one thing we do. But when we talk about sustainable development goals, a lot of times what's missed in the messaging is the fact that the majority of the world is living in a situation where if they don't have energy, they're going to be in food insecurity and energy insecurity literally overnight. And so we in the West tend to forget that when we're talking about climate security versus energy security. And so the other thing that we're looking at is, okay, how do we do food security too? And so I serve as the conduit to help connect people to talk about these things. So in Montana, most people probably don't realize this, but we have a hydroponic cattle farm that's feeding cattle and hydroponic grains at mass scale, that's saving 90% water. And they're also able to work in concert with like the Prairie Foundation and then other international groups to do rehabilitative soil and grassland projects in a major scale. And so if you can export some of that, and I hate to say export, but if you can work in a collaborative way with partners to see how that might fit within the geography and political climate of other countries, that's a great way to do it. And so, in other words, the UN serves a good purpose in their sustainability and development goals in terms of signaling what's important. But just like anything, and it's not just like Department of State or UN, this is same in DoD, is that we do a really good job at setting policy and it makes sense. But the second you get to actionable items, we have so many different bureaucracies and organizations doing things. We're throwing a lot of money at the wall and we're going inches when we need to go miles. And so what my program can do is to work around the bureaucracy a little bit, because we're not spending money on it. That's actually $0 to the US taxpayer for anything we're doing, because most of the things are virtual. And when it does come to paying for it, a lot of times it's privately funded. But what we're trying to do is break through the incredible layers of bureaucracy to provide solutions. So the John Kerry Climate Envoy has been working in Turkmenistan for a long time. We're the first people who've brought together a potential solution that's amenable to the Turkmen government in a way that they would like to see business done, and aligning them to companies who can do things. So that's kind of what my job is. I don't work at that strategic level where the UN is, where they're developing all these lines of effort within sustainability goals. My job is to provide tangible, actionable things that are, and here's kind of what I like, they're risk worthy. So 90% of what I might do might fail, but that's okay because we're not spending a lot of money, but we're finding out what doesn't work. And then when we find out things that do work, just like a venture capital model, we can scale them vertically with big USG money, if and when they're approved by much more senior levels than me, to then have a value added net effect where we're stewarding our resources to have big effects in different places. And those are, kind of in their incipient phases right now, but hopefully that answers your question. It's a really interesting one right now, and one that we kind of get to work at the forefront on a very small tactical level.
Well, Chris, we are out of time, so I just want to quickly say thank you for participating in International Careers Week. And quickly, I'm going to say thank you to our sponsors at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Clearwater Credit Union, Stockman Bank, and Humanities Montana. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Have a good one, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.